February 26, 1962. 2:47 a.m. A convoy of unmarked trucks crawls through the Nevada darkness. No headlights from oncoming traffic. No witnesses. Just the hum of diesel engines and 400 miles of empty highway stretching into nothing. The drivers carry IDs for CJ Engineering, a small trucking company out of Burbank, California. Legitimate paperwork. Proper Department of Transportation permits for oversized loads. Secretary answers the phone at their office during business hours. Tax returns filed on time. Insurance policies paid in full. Everything checks out, except CJ Engineering doesn't exist. Never did. And beneath those heavy canvas tarps, pieces of an aircraft so secret, so impossibly advanced, that a single photograph would hand the Soviet Union the intelligence coup of the century. Two sedans follow at a careful distance. They look like ordinary family cars, the kind you'd see in any suburban driveway. Chevrolets and Fords, nothing memorable. But the men inside carry concealed weapons and encrypted radios linked directly to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Their orders are simple. Get this cargo to its destination without being seen, without being photographed, without anyone asking questions they can't answer. The desert air is cold at this hour. The drivers can see their breath when they crack the windows. Highway 14 stretches north into the Mojave, empty and silent except for the growl of their engines. Somewhere ahead, past hundreds of miles of nothing, a dry lake bed waits to receive cargo that officially doesn't exist. If they fail, if even one curious motorist gets too close, if one newspaper photographer happens to be in the wrong place at the right time, America loses the Cold War's most important technological advantage before it ever takes flight. This is the story of how the CIA moved the most classified machine ever built across hundreds of miles of public highway in plain sight. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you're enjoying Shadow Works, hit that subscribe button. We bring you the classified history they don't teach in schools, and trust me, this one gets wilder than you can imagine. Now, to understand why the CIA was running a fake trucking company through the Nevada desert at 3 in the morning, we need to go back to May 1st, 1960, the day America went blind. Picture this. Francis Gary Powers is cruising at 70,000 feet over the Soviet Union in a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft. At that altitude, he's higher than 99% of the Earth's atmosphere. The sky above him is nearly black. The curvature of the planet is visible on the horizon. Below, the Soviet heartland spreads out like a map. Military bases, missile installations, nuclear facilities, all of it visible to his cameras. He's been told, guaranteed, that no Soviet weapon can touch him up here. He's been told wrong. The SA-2 missile that found him didn't need to score a direct hit. Soviet targeting technology wasn't that precise in 1960, but it didn't need to be. The missile detonated close enough to shred his aircraft's fragile wings with shrapnel, sending the U-2 tumbling from the edge of space. The aircraft broke apart around Powers as it fell. He struggled to eject, nearly trapped in the disintegrating cockpit, finally managing to bail out as the remains of his plane scattered across miles of Soviet territory. His parachute deployed. He drifted down through 70,000 feet of Soviet airspace, utterly helpless, watching the ground rise to meet him. Soviet soldiers were waiting when he landed. What happened next humiliated the United States on the world stage. President Eisenhower initially denied everything. The cover story, prepared in advance for exactly this scenario, claimed Powers was a weather research pilot who had accidentally strayed off course. NASA issued a press release about a missing weather plane near Turkey. It was a reasonable lie, plausible enough that the Soviets might not be able to disprove it, until Nikita Khrushchev sprung his trap. The Soviets had recovered not just the wreckage, but the pilot, alive, uninjured, and talking. They had his CIA identification, his maps marked with Soviet targets, his suicide needle, the L-pill he was supposed to swallow rather than be captured, unused in his pocket, the specially designed camera that had been photographing Soviet military installations, even his silver dollar, which concealed a poison-tipped needle for exactly the scenario he now found himself in. Displayed it all at a Moscow press conference, grinning like a man who had just caught his rival cheating at cards. The Paris Peace Summit, months of diplomatic preparation, the first real chance to reduce Cold War tensions, hopes for nuclear arms limitations, collapsed before the opening session. Eisenhower was forced to admit, publicly and humiliatingly, that America had been running spy flights over Soviet territory for 4 years. The U-2 program, one of the CIA's crown jewels, was effectively finished. The Soviets would shoot down any future flights, and the diplomatic cost of getting caught again was too high to risk. But here's what most people don't understand about the powers' shootdown. It wasn't just an embarrassment. It wasn't just a diplomatic setback. It was an existential crisis for American intelligence. The U-2 had been providing something invaluable: eyes over enemy territory. Those high-altitude photographs revealed Soviet bomber bases that American planners had only guessed at. They mapped missile installations that could reach the continental United States. They photographed submarine pens where nuclear-armed vessels were being constructed. They tracked the development of Soviet nuclear facilities, providing concrete evidence of capabilities that would otherwise have remained unknown. Without them, American military planners were guessing. And in the nuclear age, guessing wrong meant the end of civilization. The intelligence community called it the bomber gap, and later the missile gap. The fear that the Soviet Union had secretly built overwhelming military superiority while America wasn't watching. The U-2 had helped calm those fears by providing actual evidence of Soviet capabilities. Now that window had slammed shut, the Soviets knew what they had accomplished. After the Powers incident, they accelerated their air defense deployments with renewed confidence. Intelligence analysts watched with growing alarm as SA-2 batteries multiplied across the Soviet landscape, 200 sites by 1960, with more appearing every month. Satellite reconnaissance was still primitive, barely operational. The Corona program had managed exactly one successful film recovery by late 1960, and the images were grainy, limited in coverage, frustratingly unreliable. The film capsules sometimes missed their recovery zones and fell into the ocean. Sometimes the cameras malfunctioned. Sometimes the satellites failed to reach orbit at all. You couldn't task a satellite to photograph a specific facility on demand. You got whatever the orbital mechanics gave you, whenever they gave it, and hoped it would be useful. Human intelligence, spies on the ground, could only see so much. A Soviet officer might report that a new missile base was under construction, but he couldn't provide the precise coordinates, the exact configuration, the detailed intelligence that military planners needed. The CIA needed another way. They needed an aircraft that could do what the U-2 had done, but better, faster, higher. Something the Soviets couldn't touch, no matter how many missiles they deployed or how sophisticated their radar became. They needed the impossible. That's exactly what Kelly Johnson promised to give them. But here's where the story takes its first strange turn. Clarence Leonard Kelly Johnson was not a normal man. He designed his first aircraft at age 13, scratching out plans on notebook paper in his family's modest home in Ishpeming, Michigan. By 1959, as head of Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works division, he had already built some of the most important aircraft in American history. The P-38 Lightning, the twin-boom fighter that helped win World War II, the F-104 Starfighter, the first aircraft to hold simultaneous world records for speed, altitude, and time to climb. The U-2 itself, designed and built in just 8 months under conditions of absolute secrecy. Johnson worked 16-hour days as a matter of routine, demanded perfection from his engineers, and had an almost supernatural ability to solve problems that shouldn't have solutions. His design philosophy was radical for the aerospace industry: small teams, minimal paperwork, direct communication between engineers and machinists, decisions made in hours instead of months. The name Skunk Works came from a nearby plastics factory that produced a memorable smell, but it came to mean something else entirely, a place where impossible things became real. When the CIA came to Johnson after the Powers disaster, asking if he could build something better than the U-2, he didn't hesitate, he didn't hedge, didn't ask for years of study and analysis. He proposed an aircraft that made the U-2 look like a crop duster. The specifications were staggering. This new plane, designated the A-12 under the codename Project Oxcart, would cruise at Mach 3.2. That's more than 3 times the speed of sound. Over 2,000 miles per hour? At that velocity, you could cross the continental United States in about 70 minutes. A rifle bullet travels at roughly Mach 2. The A-12 would outrun bullets. It would fly at 85,000 feet, nearly the edge of space. It's 15,000 feet higher than the U-2 that the Soviets had just shot down. At that altitude, the sky turns purple, and the horizon curves away beneath you. The air is so thin that conventional aircraft engines can't function. Pilots would need pressure suits similar to what astronauts wear, because an unprotected human body would die within seconds at that altitude. And here's the part that seems like science fiction. This aircraft would be nearly invisible to radar. No. In 1959, decades before the word stealth entered the public vocabulary, the A-12 would become the grandfather of the SR-71 Blackbird, an aircraft so advanced that it still holds speed records more than 50 years after its retirement. No aircraft has ever flown faster or higher on a sustained basis. But before the A-12 could set any records, before it could fly a single mission, before it could even take off for the first time, someone had to build it. Building it required breaking almost every rule of aerospace engineering that existed in 1959. Stay with me here, because this detail is almost too strange to believe. At Mach 3.2, the A-12's skin would reach temperatures exceeding 500 degrees Fahrenheit during sustained flight. Friction with the atmosphere, even the thin atmosphere at 85,000 feet, would heat the aircraft until parts of it glowed dull red. The leading edges of the wings and the nose cone would be even hotter, approaching 1,000 degrees. Aluminum, the standard aircraft material since the 1930s, would soften like butter at those temperatures. Steel would weaken and eventually fail. Only one metal could survive the thermal stresses of sustained Mach 3 flight: titanium. But in 1959, the United States didn't have nearly enough titanium for a project of this magnitude. The world's largest deposits of titanium are sat in the Soviet Union, the same Soviet Union that the A-12 was being designed to spy on. The same Soviet Union whose air defenses had just shot down Francis Gary Powers. So the CIA did something audacious. They created shell companies, fake businesses with fake executives and fake business histories, registered in countries friendly to both superpowers, to purchase titanium ore from Soviet suppliers. The transactions were laundered through third countries, the paperwork carefully constructed to hide the ultimate destination. The OH was shipped to processors in Western Europe, refined into aircraft-grade titanium, and then sent to Lockheed's Burbank facility. The Soviets, hungry for hard currency, and seeing no reason to question routine commercial transactions, sold the titanium without asking too many questions. Which means the most sophisticated spy plane ever designed to penetrate Soviet airspace was built, in significant part, from Soviet raw materials. The enemy was literally supplying the metal that would be used to photograph their most sensitive military installations. If you wrote that in a spy novel, nobody would believe it. Working with titanium was its own nightmare. The metal was strong and heat-resistant, but it was also difficult to machine with existing tools. Standard drill bits went dull after a few holes. Cutting tools that worked fine on aluminum or steel would barely scratch titanium before losing their edge. Welding had to be done in completely inert atmospheres. Any contamination from oxygen or nitrogen would weaken the metal and cause invisible defects that might lead to catastrophic failure at Mach 3. Even the cadmium-plated tools commonly used in aircraft factories caused problems. The cadmium would contaminate titanium welds, creating weak spots that couldn't be detected by visual inspection. Lockheed had to develop entirely new tool sets, plated with different materials, used only for the A-12 program. Kelly Johnson later estimated his team invented over 300 new manufacturing processes just for the A-12. They weren't just building an airplane, they were inventing an entirely new way to build airplanes, techniques that would later find their way into commercial aviation and spacecraft construction. The fuel presented another unique challenge. At Mach 3 temperatures, the aircraft's fuel tanks would heat to several hundred degrees. Conventional jet fuel would boil and potentially explode under those conditions. Lockheed engineers developed a special low-volatility fuel designated JP-7. This stuff was so stable, you could throw a lit match into a bucket of it, and the match would just go out, starved of the vapors needed for combustion. Special chemical ignition systems had to be designed because normal igniters couldn't light it. The engines themselves, Pratt and Whitney J58 turbojets, were miracles of engineering. At low speeds, they operated as conventional jet engines. But at high Mach numbers, they transformed into something closer to ramjets, with bypass air flowing around the compressor stages and mixing with fuel in the afterburner.
Oh.
No engine had ever been designed to operate continuously at such extreme conditions. By early 1962, after 3 years of engineering miracles, the first A-12 components were ready for assembly. The fuselage sections, the wings, the tail surfaces, the engine nacelles, each piece a marvel of aerospace engineering, each worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. Now came the problem nobody had solved. How do you move it? This is where the real story begins. The A-12 was 102 feet long, longer than a Boeing 737. Its wingspan stretched 55 feet. Empty, it weighed 52,000 pounds. Fully fueled, over 117,000 pounds. There was no aircraft in the world that could carry it. There was no train car wide enough to hold it without modification that would attract unwanted attention. The only option was trucks on public highways through hundreds of miles of California and Nevada. In broad daylight, possible. The Soviet Union had intelligence networks across the United States, not just government spies, but a web of agents, sympathizers, and unwitting sources who reported anything unusual. The FBI estimated hundreds of Soviet intelligence officers operated under diplomatic cover in the United States. Attached to the embassy in Washington, the UN mission in New York, and consulates in other major cities. They had recruited an unknown number of American citizens as agents and cultivated countless others as sources who didn't even realize they were providing intelligence. Aerospace facilities were priority targets for Soviet surveillance. Any unusual activity at Lockheed's Burbank plant, strange shipments leaving at odd hours, oversized loads on unfamiliar trucks, would be noted, analyzed, and reported to Moscow within hours. The Soviets had patient, methodical intelligence services that excelled at piecing together patterns from fragmentary information. They also flew commercial aircraft on routes that passed near sensitive American facilities. Their intelligence services had been known to charter private aircraft for aerial photography disguised as business surveys. One photograph, a single clear image of the A-12's distinctive shape, and the entire program was compromised. Soviet engineers would recognize immediately what they were looking at. The radical design, the blended fuselage, the distinctive engine nacelles, all of it would scream high speed, high-altitude reconnaissance platform. They would know America was developing something that could penetrate their airspace with impunity. They would begin crash programs to develop countermeasures. The years of development, the hundreds of millions of dollars, Kelly Johnson's engineering miracles, all of it wasted. The A-12 had to move in secret. Complete, absolute, airtight secret. But here's the thing about secrets in America. They're almost impossible to keep. This wasn't the Soviet Union, where citizens who saw military equipment being transported knew to look away and never speak of it, where asking questions about government activities could lead to a visit from the secret police or worse. America had a free press protected by the First Amendment. It had curious citizens who considered questioning authority to be a patriotic duty. It had amateur aviation enthusiasts who tracked unusual aircraft as a hobby, building networks to share observations and speculation. It had truck drivers who talked to other truck drivers at rest stops, sharing stories about the strange loads they'd seen. It had highway patrol officers who might pull over an unusual load just to see what was under the tarp. The CIA couldn't simply classify the convoy and expect everyone to comply. They couldn't arrest every curious bystander or silence every potential witness. They needed something smarter, something that would hide in plain sight. What they came up with was brilliant. CJ Engineering appeared in the Burbank Business Registry sometime in late 1961. On paper, it looked like dozens of other small trucking companies serving Southern California's booming aerospace industry. Defense contracts were pouring into the region, factories were running 3 shifts, and oversized loads were a common sight on local highways. One more trucking company attracted no attention whatsoever. CJ Engineering had a business license filed with the state of California. It had Department of Transportation permits for oversized loads. It had insurance policies from reputable carriers. It had tax identification numbers and filed regular returns with the IRS. It even had a small office in a commercial building with a secretary who answered the phone during business hours. CJ Engineering, how may I direct your call? Anyone who called that number would reach a real person at a real desk. She would take messages, schedule appointments, handle routine correspondence, deal with the mundane administrative work of what appeared to be a legitimate business. What she didn't know, what she was never told, was that she was working for the Central Intelligence Agency. The trucks looked ordinary. You'd have a duty Kenworth and Peterbilt tractors, the kind of workhorses you'd see on any California highway, pulling flatbed trailers loaded with industrial equipment. Nothing about them suggested government ownership or classified cargo. The drivers wore ordinary work clothes, not uniforms. The trucks carried commercial license plates, not military markings. But the trailers were custom-built with features no commercial trucking company would need. Hydraulic suspension systems could raise or lower the load platform with precision measured in fractions of an inch. For loading, they could drop almost to ground level, eliminating the need for large cranes that might attract attention from aircraft or distant observers. During transport, the suspension absorbed every bump and vibration, protecting cargo far more delicate than anything a normal trucking company would haul. Temperature monitoring systems tracked conditions inside the covered load space. Climate control units, disguised to look like standard refrigeration equipment, could heat or cool the cargo area as needed. The tarps were carefully chosen. Not military canvas with obvious government markings, olive drab fabric stenciled with U.S. Army would raise immediate questions. Instead, standard commercial covers, heavy-duty and weatherproof, identical to what any trucking company might use. Secured with straps and tie-downs that looked routine, completely unremarkable. Because that was the key. The convoys couldn't be invisible. You can't make a 102-foot aircraft component disappear on a public highway. They had to be unremarkable, so ordinary that anyone who saw them would forget within minutes. The first convoy departed Lockheed's Burbank facility on February 26, 1962, shortly after midnight. The loading had taken place inside a specially modified hangar with oversized doors, surrounded by tall fences covered in opaque screening material that prevented any outside observation. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter around the clock. Security cameras monitored every approach. Workers had been told only that they were handling classified defense equipment, nothing more. By 3 a.m., the trucks were rolling north through the sleeping San Fernando Valley. The route had been planned with obsessive precision over months of preparation. Every mile had been surveyed. Every potential observation point had been identified. Every variable that could be controlled had been controlled. The obvious path, Interstate 15 through Las Vegas, was rejected immediately. Las Vegas meant tourists, gamblers, crowds of potential witnesses who might notice something unusual. The city never slept, and even at 3 a.m. people would be on the streets. Instead, the convoy would take Highway 14 north through the Mojave Desert, then Highway 95 through central Nevada, longer by several hours, but emptier, with far fewer chances for unwanted observation. The drivers were professional truckers, recruited from legitimate companies. Vetted by CIA background investigators who had examined every aspect of their lives: finances, family connections, political affiliations, drinking habits, everything. They had signed non-disclosure agreements with intimidating legal language about federal prosecution and prison time. They knew they were hauling classified military equipment. They didn't know they were carrying pieces of an aircraft that would change the course of the Cold War. That was intentional. Compartmentalized security meant nobody knew more than they absolutely needed to know. Following at a careful distance, 2 or 3 ordinary-looking sedans, Chevrolets and Fords, the kind of cars you'd see in any church parking lot or suburban driveway. Nothing memorable about them. But inside each one, CIA security officers with concealed weapons and encrypted radios. Their job was to handle anything that might compromise the operation. Curious civilians, overzealous law enforcement, mechanical breakdowns, any scenario that might expose the cargo. The contingency planning covered every imaginable situation, and some that seemed almost paranoid. Truck breakdown. Backup vehicles waited at predetermined locations along the route. Engines warm, crews ready to transfer cargo if necessary. Flat tire? Spare trucks carried complete sets of replacement tires in the correct sizes. Curious motorist? Security teams practiced what internal documents called non-confrontational deterrence, politely but firmly discouraging. Questions without creating a memorable scene. Local police stop. The drivers carried phone numbers connecting directly to military and CIA officials who could explain that this was a classified national security operation. But even the best plans can't account for everything. Somewhere in the Nevada desert, the exact location remains classified to this day. A state trooper pulled the convoy over for a routine logbook check. Standard procedure for commercial trucks at highway wait stations. Nothing unusual about it. Troopers did this dozens of times a day across Nevada. Checking that drivers weren't exceeding their legal hours, that loads were within weight limits, that paperwork was in order. What happened next would stay with that trooper for the rest of his life. He approached the cab, flashlight in hand, ready for the routine interaction he'd had 1,000 times before. The driver's hands were shaking on the steering wheel. His face was pale in the flashlight beam. Before the trooper could ask his first question, car doors opened behind him. Several men approached quickly, too quickly, flashing military identification cards. "This truck is carrying classified Air Force equipment," one of them said. His voice was calm, professional, but carried an undertone that left no room for negotiation. "You are not authorized to inspect this cargo. You are not authorized to include this stop in your shift report. You are not to discuss this encounter with anyone. Is that understood?" The trooper looked at the identification cards. They appeared genuine. He looked at the men holding them, clean-cut, alert, clearly not ordinary civilians. He looked back at the truck, at the heavy tarp, concealing something large and angular. He understood. Years later, after the A-12 program was declassified in the 1990s, that trooper wrote a confidential memo describing the encounter. He had spent his career enforcing traffic laws, checking paperwork, doing the mundane but necessary work of highway patrol. That night, for just a few minutes, he had brushed against something much larger. Something that existed in a world of secrets he wasn't supposed to know about. He never spoke of it publicly until after declassification, kept his word for over 30 years. But he wasn't the only close call. This next part nearly destroyed everything. Somewhere outside the restricted perimeter of Groom Lake. We'll never know the exact location because it remains classified. An amateur aviation photographer was waiting. He was one of those hobbyists who tracked military aircraft, noting tail numbers and flight patterns, building files of observations that he shared with other enthusiasts. It was a strange hobby to outsiders, but for those who participated, it was a passion. They knew more about American military aviation than many people who actually worked in the defense industry. This particular photographer had noticed unusual activity at a remote facility in the Nevada desert. Strange aircraft shapes visible from certain high points if you knew where to look and had good enough optics. Military traffic patterns that didn't match any known program. Trucks coming and going at odd hours. On this particular day, he had positioned himself on public land with a telephoto lens. He was on a ridge outside the restricted area, on ground owned by the Bureau of Land Management, where any American citizen had a right to be. He wasn't trespassing. He wasn't breaking any laws. When the convoy arrived and began unloading, he started shooting. Through his viewfinder, he captured something that shouldn't exist. Curved titanium surfaces unlike any aircraft he had ever seen. Shapes that didn't match any known military or civilian design. Components of a machine so secret that fewer than 1,000 people in the entire country knew its real name or purpose. He drove home with film that could have changed history. Within days, exactly how the CIA tracked him down remains classified. Security personnel arrived at his door. 2 men in ordinary suits, driving an ordinary car, showing credentials that identified them as federal agents. They didn't threaten him, didn't shout or make accusations, didn't confiscate his equipment, which might have attracted unwanted attention or given him grounds for a legal complaint. What they did was worse, they explained, calmly and precisely. Exactly what he had photographed, and exactly what would happen if those images ever became public. They talked about national security, talked about federal espionage laws and the penalties for violating them, years in prison, financial ruin, a destroyed reputation. They talked about his family, his career, his future. When they left, the photographer walked into his darkroom. He had a choice to make. The film sat in its canister, undeveloped, could process it, see what he had captured, perhaps sell the images to a newspaper, or he could make it disappear. The canister went into a drawer. It stayed there for decades, undeveloped, its contents never seen by human eyes. In interviews conducted after declassification in the 1990s, the photographer described the encounter as polite but firm. He had spent 30 years keeping that secret, never telling his wife what was in that drawer, never mentioning the incident to friends, carrying the knowledge of what he had almost done. They were very professional, he said. They made it clear I had a choice. Just made sure I understood the consequences of choosing wrong. What strikes me about these incidents is how fragile it all was. The United States was an open society with constitutional protections against government overreach. Citizens could travel public roads, photograph from public land, ask questions of public officials, publish what they learned. The CIA couldn't simply arrest everyone who got curious. They couldn't build walls around hundreds of miles of highway. What they could do was manage the curiosity, intercept it before it became dangerous, redirect it away from classified programs. Make cooperation seem like the obvious choice, and resistance seem like the path to ruin. It worked. Barely. But it worked. The convoys pushed through the night, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Passing through the small towns of central Nevada during the hours when most residents were asleep, Beatty, Goldfield, Tanapa, names that barely registered on national maps, communities of a few hundred or few thousand people who had learned to ignore the strange things that happened in the desert around them. The Nevada test site lay just to the east, where the government detonated nuclear weapons in tests that lit up the sky and rattled windows for hundreds of miles. The locals were accustomed to strangeness. Strange trucks in the night were nothing new. At an unmarked junction on Highway 95, the convoy turned east onto Groom Lake Road, a 15-mile stretch of unpaved dirt leading into restricted territory. The transition from public highway to classified ground happened without ceremony. One moment, you were on a road any American could drive. The next, you were in a world of secrets. Security checkpoints stopped any unauthorized vehicles long before they could see anything sensitive. The guards were polite but inflexible. No, you could not proceed. No, they could not explain why. Please turn around. This was restricted government property. Those final 15 miles were the most anxious part of every journey. The road was rough, washboarded dirt that forced the drivers to slow to a crawl. Every bump and pothole threatened the precious cargo. Suspension systems absorbed what they could, but some jolts were unavoidable. The sun would be rising soon, and the convoy needed to be inside the hangars before full daylight exposed them to potential Soviet satellites passing overhead. At the facility, ground crews waited in hangars designed specifically to hide the A-12. The buildings were positioned to block observation from any possible angle outside the perimeter. Their massive doors faced away from the most likely approach directions. The roofs were camouflaged to blend with the surrounding desert when viewed from above, patches of paint and netting that broke up the regular shapes of buildings. The trucks backed in. The doors closed. For the first time in hundreds of miles, the cargo was truly safe. Outside, the sun rose over the Nevada desert, illuminating nothing but empty scrubland and distant mountains. The road the convoy had traveled was already empty, the tire tracks slowly filling with wind-blown dust. Anyone watching would have seen ordinary hangars on a remote military base, a facility that had existed for years. It's nothing worth remembering. By April 1962, the first A-12 had been assembled inside those secret hangars. Thousands of individual parts, each manufactured with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, fitted together into something that looked less like an airplane and more like a visitor from another world. The aircraft's shape was unlike anything that had flown before. A needle-thin fuselage blended smoothly into wing surfaces that curved and flowed like organic forms. The engine nacelles bulged from the wings like swollen muscles. The whole machine had a predatory look, all speed and purpose, clearly designed for a realm of flight that conventional aircraft couldn't reach. On April 25, 1962, Lockheed test pilot Lou Schock climbed into the cockpit for the first time. He was one of a handful of pilots in the world qualified for what he was about to attempt. A man who had spent his career flying experimental aircraft at the edge of what was possible, who understood that every first flight might be his last. The engines lit. The A-12 rolled down the runway, accelerating faster than any aircraft Schock had ever flown. The nose lifted. The main gear left the ground. The most secret aircraft ever built was airborne. The flight lasted only minutes. Top speed, 300 miles per hour, barely a tenth of what the aircraft would eventually achieve. Maximum altitude, a few thousand feet, low enough that a private pilot in a Cessna could have watched from above. By the standards of what the A-12 would eventually accomplish, it was practically standing still, but the aircraft flew. The engines worked. The controls responded. Kelly Johnson's impossible machine was real. Over the following months, test pilots gradually expanded the envelope faster, higher, pushing toward the performance specifications that existed only on engineering drawings. Each flight revealed new challenges, handling characteristics that changed dramatically at different speeds, control surfaces that behaved differently in the thin air of high altitude, temperatures that warped components in unexpected ways. The test program was methodical, patient, rigorous. Each flight built on the lessons of the one before. Each problem was analyzed, understood, solved. The A-12 crept toward its design performance, one careful step at a time. And then came the day that everything went wrong. May 24th, 1963. Clear skies over the Nevada desert. The second A-12, piloted by Kenneth Collins, was testing high-altitude stall characteristics, probing the edges of the aircraft's performance envelope to understand exactly where the limits lay. This was dangerous work. Every aircraft has a speed below which it can't maintain flight, the stall speed. For most planes, stalling means a momentary loss of control, a nose drop, a recovery. But at 70,000 feet, in an aircraft pushing the boundaries of aerodynamic knowledge, a stall could become something much worse. Somewhere above the desert, at an altitude where the sky was nearly black and the curve of the Earth was visible on the horizon, something went wrong. The A-12 entered a spin. The aircraft began rotating around its vertical axis while simultaneously falling. The desert floor rotating beneath Collins like a view from a carnival ride from hell. He fought the controls, running through emergency procedures he had practiced dozens of times, trying to recover. The altimeter unwound with terrifying speed. 70,000 feet, 60,000, 50,000, still spinning, still falling. There was no saving it. Collins had seconds to make a decision. Ejected. The seat rocketed clear of the disintegrating aircraft, explosive bolts firing, the wind blast hitting him like a wall. His parachute deployed, the drogue chute first, then the main canopy, spreading above him against the impossibly blue sky. But something was wrong. The main chute hadn't fully inflated. The lines were tangled, or the canopy was damaged, or some malfunction had occurred that would never be fully explained. Collins fell faster than a parachute descent should allow. Kenneth Collins died in the Nevada desert that day. His family was told almost nothing about how or why. The wreckage scattered across several miles of terrain outside the restricted area within minutes, before any civilian authorities could respond, before any news crews could be alerted. CIA security teams had established a perimeter. They arrived in unmarked vehicles, fanning out across the crash site, securing every piece of debris. They told local law enforcement that a military aircraft had crashed and the site was classified. No further information would be provided. No photographs were to be taken. The debris was collected over the following days. Every fragment of titanium and wire and shattered instrument, and trucked back to Groom Lake for analysis. Investigators determined that an aerodynamic instability at high angles of attack, a characteristic of the aircraft's design that hadn't been fully predicted, had triggered the fatal spin. Modifications were made to the flight control systems. Testing procedures were updated to avoid similar situations. The program continued. Kenneth Collins became a classified statistic. One of several A-12 pilots who had died during the program, their sacrifices acknowledged only in sealed files and redacted reports. His widow received a folded flag and condolences that couldn't explain what her husband had actually been doing. Their children grew up not knowing their father had been testing an aircraft that would change aviation history. The obituary said he died in a military aircraft accident. It was true, as far as it went. The rest of the truth would stay buried for 30 years. This was the hidden cost of secrecy. Not just money, lives. Lives that couldn't be publicly mourned or properly honored. By 1965, 12 A-12s had been delivered to Groom Lake, each transported by the same careful procedures that had protected the first. The test program had proven everything Kelly Johnson had promised. The aircraft could sustain Mach 3.2 for extended periods. It could reach altitudes above 90,000 feet. Its radar cross-section was indeed far smaller than any aircraft of comparable size. The impossible machine was ready for war. On May 31, 1967, an A-12 launched from Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, Japan, on the first operational mission of Project Black Shield. The target? Surface-to-air missile sites in North Vietnam that were shooting down American pilots with alarming regularity. American commanders needed to know exactly where those missiles were positioned, how they were deployed, what their capabilities were. The aircraft crossed into North Vietnamese airspace at 80,000 feet, traveling at 3 times the speed of sound. Below, the Vietnamese landscape spread out like a relief map. Rivers, mountains, cities, the pockmarked terrain of a country being torn apart by war. North Vietnamese radar tracked the aircraft. They could see something was there, a blip moving impossibly fast across their screens, but their missiles couldn't catch it. By the time targeting computers calculated an intercept solution, the A-12 was already miles away, its cameras having captured everything. The mission was a complete success. The cameras recorded surface-to-air missile positions with enough clarity to identify specific equipment types. Intelligence that would have taken weeks to gather through other means arrived on analysts' desks within hours. American strike planners could now target the most dangerous missile sites with precision, saving countless pilots who might otherwise have flown into deadly ambushes. Over the following months, the A-12 flew 29 missions over North Vietnam and 1 over North Korea. It was never hit, was never seriously threatened. For the first time since France's scary powers fell from the sky, America could see behind enemy lines without losing pilots to enemy fire. But the A-12's operational life would be brief. In 1968, the CIA decided to retire the fleet in favor of its successor, the SR-71 Blackbird. The SR-71 was larger, had longer range, and featured a 2-seat configuration that allowed a dedicated reconnaissance systems operator to manage the complex sensor systems while the pilot concentrated on flying. The Air Force would operate it, replacing CIA contractors with military personnel. The decision was controversial within the intelligence community. The A-12 had proven itself capable. It had penetrated some of the most heavily defended airspace in the world and returned with invaluable intelligence. But operational costs were extraordinary. Each A-12 mission required specialized tanker aircraft to refuel the jets in flight, maintenance crews with high-level security clearances, dedicated intelligence analysts to process the imagery. The Air Force argued that the SR-71 could perform the same mission at lower ongoing cost. On June 4, 1968, the last operational A-12 mission was flown. The surviving aircraft returned to Groom Lake, where most were eventually put into storage. The program that had consumed years of effort, hundreds of millions of dollars, and several lives was over. Some of the aircraft would later be transferred to museums after declassification in the 1990s. Today, visitors can see them and wonder at their strange, beautiful shapes. Most don't know the full story of how they got from the drawing board to the flight line. CJ Engineering continued to exist on paper for several years after the last A-12 component reached Groom Lake. The CIA maintained the fiction, paying the minimal operating expenses, filing tax returns, keeping the phone number active, just in case they needed the cover story again for another classified transport operation. The secretary continued answering the phone, taking messages for a trucking company that no longer hauled anything, working for people whose true employer she never knew. Eventually, even she was let go, probably with a generous severance and a reminder about the confidentiality agreements she had signed. When the company was finally dissolved in the late 1960s, it happened quietly. No announcement, no explanation. No newspaper item about a small business closing its doors. The office in Burbank closed. The phone was disconnected. The business registration was allowed to lapse. Anyone investigating the company's history would find nothing suspicious. Just another small trucking company that went out of business like thousands of others do every year. The CIA had erased its tracks so completely that even decades later, researchers have found few documents about the company. It existed. It served its purpose. It vanished, leaving almost nothing behind. And here's what I keep thinking about. The people who made those midnight runs through the Nevada desert, the truck drivers, the security officers, the logistics coordinators, the clerks who processed paperwork, most of them went to their graves without recognition. They had signed agreements promising silence. They kept those promises for decades, even after retirement, even after the memories faded, even when the people they had worked with were long dead, and it no longer seemed to matter. They couldn't tell their wives what they had done, couldn't explain to their children why certain topics were off limits, why questions about that period of their lives went unanswered. They carried their secrets alone, in a country that celebrated openness and free speech and despised government secrecy. Were they heroes? Complicit servants of an unaccountable state? Something in between? I don't think there's an easy answer. The Cold War was a struggle between systems, and secrecy was a weapon in that struggle. The intelligence gathered by the A-12 may have prevented miscalculations that could have led to nuclear war. The people who kept those secrets may have saved millions of lives. They may have participated in an apparatus of government deception that eroded democratic accountability and set precedents for abuses that continue to this day. History doesn't provide clean moral conclusions. The A-12 program cost hundreds of millions of dollars, billions in today's money. It employed thousands of people across dozens of facilities and contractors. It pushed the boundaries of metallurgy, aerodynamics, propulsion, and manufacturing technology. And for most of its existence, almost nobody knew it was happening, but its legacy extends far beyond the aircraft itself. The titanium manufacturing techniques developed for the A-12 found their way into commercial aviation. The materials science research benefited industries that had nothing to do with military aerospace. Medical devices, sporting equipment, architectural applications, all benefited from processes invented to build a spy plane. The radar-absorbent materials pioneered on the A-12 became the foundation for true stealth aircraft a generation later. The F-117 Nighthawk and B-2 Spirit bomber used principles that Kelly Johnson's engineers had first explored in the early 1960s. Without the A-12, the stealth revolution might have been delayed by decades. The logistics methods, fake companies, compartmentalized security, careful management of public observation became templates for every classified program that followed. When the Air Force developed the F-117 in the 1980s, program managers studied the Oxcart experience. But here's the question that haunts me. The Cold War was an existential struggle, the intelligence gathered by the A-12 and its successor. The SR-71 gave American policymakers information they desperately needed. That information may have prevented miscalculations that could have led to nuclear war. The stakes were, quite literally, the survival of human civilization. Does that justify the secrecy? The surveillance of American citizens who stumbled too close to the truth? Families who lost husbands and fathers and were told nothing about how or why? The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. The threat of nuclear annihilation receded, though it never entirely disappeared. We can look back now with the clarity of hindsight and see that the United States won, that the sacrifices and secrets and moral compromises produced the desired outcome. But the people who lived through it couldn't know that. They made choices in darkness, with incomplete information, gambling on outcomes they couldn't predict. Today, you can see an A-12 at the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. It sits outside the building, a monument to an agency that still keeps most of its work secret. Another sits at the USS Alabama Battleship Memorial Park in Mobile, Alabama. A few others are scattered in aviation museums across the country, their engines silent, their cameras long removed, their secrets mostly declassified. They look like sculptures from a fever dream. All curves and angles, impossibly sleek, clearly designed for speeds that ordinary aircraft couldn't imagine. Visitors photograph them, pose in front of them, marvel at their strange beauty. Most walk past without understanding what they're seeing. The placards mention speed records and altitude achievements, technical specifications that made the A-12 revolutionary. They don't mention the fake trucking company, the midnight convoys, the photographers who were visited by men in suits, the pilots who died and whose families learned the truth only decades later, the docents, well-meaning volunteers who lead tour groups through these museums, often don't know the full story themselves. But maybe that's appropriate. The A-12 was designed for shadows, flew at the edge of space, invisible to most radar, too fast to intercept, photographing secrets that weren't supposed to exist. The people who built it and flew it and transported it across the Nevada desert were themselves shadow workers, doing essential jobs that could never be acknowledged, keeping secrets that could never be shared, contributing to victories that could never be celebrated. Somewhere in Nevada, the road is still there, not the paved highways. Those have been widened and resurfaced many times since 1962. Modern interstates replacing the two-lane roads the convoys traveled. But Groom Lake Road, that 15-mile stretch of dirt leading into restricted territory, still exists. It's still guarded. It still leads to a facility where, presumably, the descendants of the A-12 are being developed and tested. The same mountains still surround the dry lake bed. The same desert wind still blows across the flats. The same security protocols, updated for new technologies, but following the same basic principles, still keep the curious at bay. If you drove that road late at night, which you can't, because you'd be stopped long before reaching anything sensitive, you might see trucks moving through the darkness. Different trucks, different cargo, same secrecy. The A-12 flew higher and faster than anything before it. It outran missiles and outclimbed interceptors and photographed targets that had never been seen by American eyes. It changed what was possible in aviation and laid the groundwork for technologies we still use today. But before it could do any of that, it had to travel 400 miles on public highways, hidden under canvas tarps, escorted by ordinary-looking sedans, protected by a fake trucking company that existed only on paper. The engineers who designed the A-12 were geniuses. Pilots who flew it were heroes. But the truck drivers who hauled its components through the night, the security officers who discouraged curious observers, the secretary who answered phones for a company that didn't exist, they were part of the miracle too. History remembers Kelly Johnson. It remembers the Blackbird. It remembers the speed records and the reconnaissance triumphs and the technological breakthroughs. It forgets the people who made those midnight runs and took their secrets to the grave. Maybe it's time we remembered. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to Shadowworks. We tell the stories that history tried to forget, the classified operations, the secret programs, the men and women who served in the shadows and never got the recognition they deserved. Like this video, share it with someone who appreciates Cold War history, and leave a comment telling us which secret program you want us to investigate next. The truth is out there. You just have to dig for it.